They were the most feared creatures in the known universe. They stood 3 meters tall with black scales that could stop bullets. Their claws carried poison that killed in seconds. Their eyes could see through walls and metal. For thousands of years, they had conquered planet after planet. They never asked for anything. They simply took what they wanted. Every species in 12 galaxies knew to run when they saw a ship. But on the frozen moon called Seven, far from any territory, a mother named was dying. Her ship had crashed 2 days ago during a fight with enemy hunters. A plasma blast had torn through her side, and violet blood still leaked from the wound despite everything she had tried. The cold was making it worse. This moon was nothing but ice and snow, and even her thick scales could not keep the freeze from reaching her bones. None of that mattered, too. She had faced death before. What made her heart twist with fear was the small escape pod behind her, where her 3 cubs huddled together for warmth. Was the oldest, already showing the pride of a future warrior. Was clever and quick, always watching everything. And then there was the smallest one, the runt of the group. Was weak by standards but loved her fiercely. They were only 3 cycles old. Their scales were still soft. They could not hunt yet. They could not survive the cold alone. Tried to stand, but her legs gave out. She fell into the snow, and it took all her strength to lift her head. Through the blowing ice, she saw something that made her pause. Lights, small, warm lights about a kilometer away. She activated her scanner with a shaking claw. The reading came back quickly. It was a research station, very small, probably only 1 or 2 beings inside. The heat signature told her what species lived there. Humans. Made a sound that was almost a laugh. Humans were everywhere in this galaxy, spreading like insects across every rock and moon they could find. They were small, soft, and weak. Their skin tore easily. They had no claws, no venom, no natural weapons at all. By every measure, they were prey animals who had somehow learned to build starships. They had not bothered to conquer human space. Why would they? Humans were not worth the effort. They were beneath notice. But had heard strange stories about humans. Whispers that passed between warriors late at night. Stories so strange they seemed like lies. Humans, the stories said, collected other creatures. Not as slaves or food, but as something else entirely. They took animals into their homes and fed them. They kept creatures that served no purpose, gave them names, and wept when they died. They adopted young that were not their own, sometimes young from completely different species. It was madness. It went against every law of nature. Predators did not nurture prey. Strong species did not waste resources on the weak. Yet humans did these things constantly, as if it were the most natural behavior in the universe. Looked back at her cubs, was trying to look brave, but she could see him shaking. Eyes were wide with fear he was too proud to show. Little had buried herself under her brothers, seeking any warmth she could find. Without, they would freeze to death within hours. There was no other option, no other choice. Moving slowly, fighting against the pain that screamed through her body with every motion, crawled to the escape pod. Her cubs made frightened sounds when they saw how badly she was hurt. "Quiet," she told them, her voice gentle despite everything. "Mother needs you to be brave." She picked them up one by one, tucking them against her chest where her body heat was strongest. Then she began the longest walk of her life. The kilometer to the human station felt like 1,000, fell 7 times. Each time she forced herself back up because her cubs needed her to keep moving. The wind cut through her scales like knives. Her blood left a violet trail in the snow behind her. Finally, she reached the station door. It was a small building meant for maybe 2 or 3 humans at most. Through the frost-covered window, she could see warm light inside. She could smell food cooking. It was shelter. It was survival. But not for her. She was too far gone now, and she knew it. The wound in her side had taken too much. She would not live through another night. Set her cubs down on the metal platform in front of the door. They cried out for her, reaching with their small claws, not understanding what was happening. "Stay," she commanded. It was the hardest word she had ever spoken. She pressed her claw against the emergency beacon on the door frame. A loud alarm began to ring inside the station, then forced herself to move away, dragging her broken body into the shadows of a nearby rock formation. She would not die where her cubs could see, but she would watch. She needed to know if the stories about humans were true. The door opened, spilling warm light onto the snow. A human female stood there. She was small, as all humans were, with black hair and brown eyes. She wore a thick coat and held some kind of tool in her hand. Her face showed shock as she looked down at the 3 cubs hissing and shaking on her doorstep. Waited for the human to scream, to run, to slam the door and leave the cubs to die. Instead, the human woman knelt down in the snow. Her face changed into something soft, something did not have a word for. "Oh, you poor things," the human said quietly. "You must be so cold." And she smiled. Watched from the shadows, violet blood pooling beneath her, as the human woman carefully picked up Little and held her close. It seemed the stories were true after all. The human woman's name was Park. She was 34 years old and worked as a scientist who studied alien life. She had been alone at this small station for 3 months, and she had expected to stay alone for 3 more. The winter rotation on 7 was quiet work, mostly watching instruments and writing reports. She had not expected to find 3 baby apex predators on her doorstep. Knew what were. Everyone in the galaxy knew. She had seen pictures of full-grown warriors, terrifying creatures that could tear through metal with their bare claws. The 3 cubs shaking in front of her would grow into those monsters someday. Every rule she had learned told her to close the door, call for help, request an emergency evacuation. These creatures were dangerous beyond measure, even as bobbies. But looked at their trembling bodies. She saw how their soft scales had turned pale from the cold. She heard the small, frightened sounds they made. And she simply could not leave them to die. She brought them inside one by one. The biggest one tried to bite her as she picked him up. His tiny teeth scraped against her gloves but could not break through, just held him firmly and carried him to the warm room near the heating unit. Came next. He hissed at her the entire time, trying to look fierce, but his body was shaking so badly he could barely stand. Wrapped him in a blanket and set him beside his brother. Little was the easiest. She was too cold and too tired to fight. She just looked up with large golden eyes and made a soft crying sound. Felt her heart break a little. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." The first 3 days were very hard. The cubs did not trust her. Why would they? She was a stranger and they were predators by nature. Attacked her constantly, scratching her hands and arms until they were covered in small cuts. Watched her every move with suspicious eyes, ready to strike if she made any sudden movements. Even Little would snap its fingers when she tried to pet her. They refused to eat the protein paste offered them. They knocked over equipment and tore holes in her blankets. They howled at night, strange alien sounds that echoed through the small station. Did not give up. She learned to read their body language. When their scales lay flat against their bodies, they were scared. When their tails curled up, they were curious. When they showed their teeth, they were warning her to back away. She discovered that they could not control their own body heat yet. They needed warmth from outside sources, like baby reptiles on Earth. So built them a nest in the warmest corner of the station, using her own bedding and extra heating pads she found in storage. On the 2nd day, bit her arm so deeply that blood ran down to her elbow. The wound needed emergency medical sealant to close. It hurt terribly, and it would leave a scar. Cleaned the wound, bandaged her arm, and went right back to caring for the cubs. She did not she did not punish him. She simply spoke to him in a calm voice and offered him food again. Stared at her as if she had lost her mind. On the fourth day, everything changed. Little stopped eating. Her breathing became rough and heavy. Her scales, which should have been growing darker as she warmed up, stayed pale and gray. When touched her, she felt heat coming off the small body like fire. Had developed an infection. Her lungs were filling with fluid. Searched through every medical supply she had. Nothing was designed for biology. She did not know what medicines would help and what would hurt. She had no way to call a specialist because the winter storms had knocked out long-range communication 3 days ago. She was alone with a dying baby alien and no idea what to do. So did the only thing she could. She held close to her chest and tried everything. She adjusted the humidity in the room, making the air wet and warm to help breathe. She created a small tent from blankets to keep the moisture around the cub. She fed water drop by drop, using her own fingers. And she stayed awake. For 47 hours, did not sleep. She monitored its breathing, counting each rough inhale and exhale. She changed the heating pads. She sang old songs her grandmother had taught her when she was a child, Korean lullabies about moons and mountains and sleeping peacefully. And watched from their corner of the nest. They had stopped attacking 2 days ago. Now they just stared at her, their golden eyes following her every movement as she fought to save their sister. On the morning of the 6th day, fever broke. Her breathing cleared. Her scales began to darken to a healthy gray-black color. She opened her eyes, looked up at, and made a soft purring sound. Burst into tears. She sat on the floor of her small station, holding a baby apex predator in her arms, and cried from relief and exhaustion, and crept closer, confused by the sound she was making. When they reached her, they did something unexpected. They curled up beside her. By the end of the 7th day, all 3 cubs slept in its lap while she read her research notes. Sometimes she would reach down and scratch behind their ear ridges. A spot she had discovered made them purr with contentment. Outside, hidden in an old mining shaft, watched through the station's external cameras that she had hacked into with the last of her strength. Her wound was slowly healing, bodies were tough, but her mind could not understand what her eyes were seeing. A prey creature had fought death itself to save her child. Had never heard her cubs purr before. Weeks passed on the frozen moon. The storms came and went. The sun rose and set in its strange pattern, and inside the small research station, something impossible was happening. Watched it all. Her body had healed enough for her to move again. The wound in her side had closed, leaving only a thick scar. She could have taken her cubs back at any time. She could have killed the human and returned to space with her children. But she did not. Instead, she stayed hidden in the abandoned mining shaft a kilometer away, watching through the cameras she had connected to the station's system. She needed to understand what she was seeing before she acted. The human woman was teaching her cubs things that no would ever teach. The first lesson was about sharing. Food on 7 was limited, had enough supplies for herself, but adding 3 growing cubs made things difficult. When mealtime came, would divide the food into 4 equal portions, 1 for each cub, 1 for herself. Watched in confusion. Among the strongest ate first and took the most. The weak ate last and took what was left. This was the natural way. This was how nature worked. But gave the same amount to everyone. Even more strange, when the cubs were extra hungry, would give up her own portion and go without food herself. At first, the cubs did not understand, would try to steal food from because she was the smallest, but would stop him gently, not with violence, but by taking the food back and returning it too. We share, would say, everyone eats. It took 2 weeks, but slowly saw something change in her oldest son. Began leaving small pieces of his food near without being told. He was copying the human. The second lesson was about patience. Was the most aggressive of the 3 cubs. When he wanted something, he would demand it with hisses and growls. If that did not work, he would try to take it by force. responded to this in a strange way. When was aggressive, she simply did nothing. She did not give him what he wanted. She did not fight back. She just waited. But when approached her calmly, when he made soft sounds instead of harsh ones, when he asked instead of demanded, would give him what he needed immediately. Had trained warriors for many years. She knew that creatures learned from what brought them results, was learning that aggression brought nothing, while calmness brought everything. Within a month had changed completely. He still had the spirit of a hunter, but he had learned to control it. He had learned that not every problem needed to be solved with teeth and claws. The third lesson was the strangest of all. It was about play. Among the cubs played to practice hunting. Every game was about catching prey, fighting enemies, building the skills needed to kill. Play was training for violence. Games were different. She built puzzles for the cubs, hiding treats inside containers that they had to figure out how to open. There was no prey to catch, no enemy to defeat. The only purpose was to make them think in new ways. She rolled balls for them to chase, but not to practice hunting movements. Just for fun, just to run and jump and feel their bodies move. She made toys from spare parts and let them destroy them, not because destruction had any purpose, but because sometimes it felt good to tear things apart. Watched her children play without purpose and found herself feeling a strange ache in her chest. Cubs did not play for joy. Cubs trained. Had her children been missing something all along? Then came the day that changed everything. Got sick. It was a simple human illness, something in her lungs that made her cough and gave her a fever. She had medicine for it, and she knew she would recover in a few days. But for those few days, she could barely get out of bed. The cubs could have done anything during this time. They could have escaped into the snow. They could have torn apart the station. They could have attacked while she was weak. Watched the cameras with her claws digging into the frozen ground, waiting to see what her children would do without the human controlling them. What she saw destroyed everything she believed about the universe. Gathered blankets from around the station and dragged them to bed. He piled them on top of her carefully, trying not to wake her, making sure she was warm. Stood guard at the door. There was no threat, nothing to protect against, but he stood there anyway, watching the entrance, hissing at nothing. He had decided that the human needed protection, and he would give it. Little climbed into the bed and curled up against chest. Her small body generated heat, the same way had generated heat for when she was sick weeks ago. The cub was trying to return the favor. They were taking care of her. Children, born from a line of killers that stretched back 100 generations, were caring for a creature they could have easily killed. She stayed in that mining shaft for 3 more hours, staring at the screen, unable to move. Her mind kept trying to reject what she was seeing, but her eyes would not let her look away. Did not have a word for what the cubs were doing, but had studied other languages in her years as a hunter. She knew the human word. The word was love. And somehow, impossibly, this small soft human had taught her predator children how to feel it. 3 months after the crash, finally decided to show herself. The winter storms had grown weaker. The sun stayed in the sky a little longer each day. Inside the small station, had just finished feeding the cubs their evening meal when she felt something change in the air. The cubs felt it too. All 3 of them suddenly went still, their scales shifting color slightly, their golden eyes turning toward the door. They knew what was outside. They could smell it. Their mother had come. Had known for weeks that the mother was alive. Her sensors had picked up the heat signature in the old mining shaft. She had seen the footprints in the snow that appeared some nights, circling the station but never coming close. She knew she was being watched. She could have called for military help. The communication array had been working again for over a month. One message to the nearest human outpost would have brought soldiers to kill or capture the. Had not sent that message. Instead, she had started leaving things outside the station door. Extra food, medical supplies that she knew would work on bodies. She never saw them get taken, but they always disappeared by morning. Now, as the door alarm beeped to signal something approaching, took a deep breath and opened it. Stood in the fatting light of the alien sunset. She was huge, nearly 3 times height, with scales as black as space itself. The scar on her side was visible, a twisted line of lighter tissue. Her golden eyes, so much like her children's eyes, stared down at the small human woman. Did not run. She did not scream. She simply stepped aside and gestured for to come in. The cubs rushed forward the moment they saw their mother. They made sounds had never heard before, high cries of recognition and joy. They climbed over each other trying to reach, their small claws grabbing at her legs. But then something strange happened. Halfway across the room, all 3 cubs stopped. They looked back at, standing alone by the door, and their happy cries became confused whimpers. They were caught between 2 beings they cared about, unable to choose. Felt something twist in her chest. Her children loved her, she could see that, but they also loved this human. They did not want to leave her. For a long moment, no one moved. Then walked forward slowly, her hands raised to show she was not a threat. She stopped a few feet away from and looked up at the towering predator. "I am glad you healed," said. Her voice was calm and warm. "I was worried about you." His claws twitched. This was wrong. This tiny creature should be terrified. She should be begging for her life, promising to hand over the cubs in exchange for mercy. That was how prey behaved. "Why?" asked. Her voice was deep and rough from months of not speaking. "Why did you save them? Why did you save me?" Thought about the question for a moment. It seemed so obvious to her, but she could tell that the truly did not understand. "Because they needed help," said simply. "Because you needed help. We are predators, you are prey. Your actions make no sense." Smiled slightly. "Maybe your way of thinking is too small." Scales shifted with sudden anger. No one spoke to her that way. No one called them small. She could kill this human with one swipe of her claw. She could end this conversation and take her cubs and leave this frozen moon forever. But she did not move. Because her children were watching, and because she needed to understand. Saw the anger and did not back away from it. She had faced these cubs for 3 months. She had learned that aggression was often just fear wearing a mask. "Humans are not strong like your kind," continued. "We are not fast. We have no claws or poison. If we lived by your rules, we would have died out long ago." She sat down on the floor, making herself even smaller, even less threatening. The cubs immediately came to her, settling around her like they had done so many nights before, leaned against her shoulder, lay at her feet, crawled into her lap. Watched her children choose a human over their own mother, and the pain of it nearly broke her. "We survived because we help each other," said. "Not just our own families, not just our own species. We help anyone who needs it." She stroked Scales gently. "We take in animals that could kill us. We cry over creatures that cannot understand our tears. We love things simply because they exist." "That is weakness," said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "Your son brought me a dead animal yesterday," replied. "He hunted it and killed it, but he did not eat it. He gave it to me. A gift. He learned to hunt, but he also learned that some things are more important than eating." She looked up with steady eyes. "I did not make your children weak. I taught them that strength is not just about killing. Strength is also about choosing when not to kill. Strength is protecting the helpless. Strength is love." Stood very still for a long time. Her mind was at war with itself. Everything she had been taught said this was wrong. Everything she was seeing said this was right. Her cubs were healthy, they were happy. They had skills that no child had ever developed. They could hunt, yes, but they could also care. They could kill, but they could also love. They were something new, something better. Slowly lowered herself to the ground until she was sitting across from. It was a position of equality, something no had ever offered to a human before. "Teach me," said quietly. "Teach me what you taught them." Smile grew wider and warmer. "That might take a while," she said. "I have time," replied, and for the first time in her life she meant it. She was not thinking about conquests or hunts or enemies. She was thinking about learning something new. Outside, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, watching over the small station where a predator was learning to be something more. 1 year later, the great hall of the Galactic Council fell into complete silence. The council was made up of representatives from over 200 species across the known galaxies. They met once every cycle to discuss trade, territory, and the endless small conflicts that arose when so many different peoples shared the stars. It was usually boring work, full of long speeches and complicated agreements. Today was different. Today I had asked to speak. They did not come to councils. They did not ask permission for anything. For thousands of years, they had simply taken what they wanted and destroyed anything that stood in their way. The idea of a requesting diplomatic relations was so strange that many representatives thought it was a trick or a trap. But the message had been clear. High Commander of the Dominion wanted to address the council, and she was bringing a human with her. When the doors opened, every eye in the chamber turned to watch. Walked in first. She was even more impressive than the story suggested, her black scales gleaming under the lights, her golden eyes sweeping across the room with calm confidence. She moved with the grace of a predator who knew she had nothing to fear from anyone present. Behind her came 3 younger. They were not fully grown yet, but already they stood taller than most other species in the room. Their scales were darker than their mother's, and their eyes held a strange softness that no one had ever seen in before. And walking among them, looking tiny but completely unafraid, was a human woman carrying a simple data pad. The representatives whispered to each other in shock. A human, walking freely among, not as a prisoner or slave but as an equal, it seemed impossible. Reached the center of the chamber and stopped. She looked around at the hundreds of faces staring at her, some with fear, some with hatred, all with confusion. Then she began to speak. "I have conquered worlds," said. Her voice filled the hall without effort. "I have destroyed fleets. I have killed more enemies than I can count. For most of my life I believed that strength was the only thing that mattered. The strong take, the weak give. This is what I was taught. This is what every is taught." She paused and looked back at her children. 1 year ago, I was dying on a frozen moon far from home. I had no choice but to leave my cubs with a human, a species I had always considered beneath notice. I expected her to abandon them, or fear them, or try to use them somehow. The oldest cub moved to stand beside his mother. He was nearly full grown now, his scales thick and strong. But when he looked at, his fierce eyes became gentle. "Instead," continued, "she nearly died trying to save the smallest one from an illness. She stayed awake for 2 days, singing human songs, fighting for a life that meant nothing to her own survival." The chamber was completely silent. No one even breathed loudly. "I spent months watching her through hidden cameras. I saw her teach my children things I never could have taught them. I saw her show them patience when they attacked her. I saw her share her food when she had barely enough for herself. I saw her play with them, not to train them for battle, but simply to make them happy." His voice grew quieter, but somehow it carried even further. "And I saw my children care for her when she became sick. Predators, born from 100 generations of killers, choosing to protect a creature they could have easily destroyed." She turned to face the council directly. "I have spent the last year studying humanity. I stationed observers at their orphanages, their hospitals, their animal shelters. I watched them adopt children from other species. I watched them cry over stories about creatures that do not even exist. I watched them risk their lives for pets, for strangers, even for enemies who had hurt them. stepped forward to stand beside. She looked small next to the towering, but there was no fear in her face, only quiet pride. "This woman," said, placing one massive clawed hand gently on shoulder, "got sick from a fever caused by a scratch from my son. When she recovered, she did not punish him. She did not abandon him. She taught him to be more careful with his claws, and then she held him while he slept." Some of the representatives looked at each other with wide eyes. Others had tears forming. "My species has conquered 30 star systems. We believed ourselves to be the ultimate predators in the universe. We were wrong." Let those words hang in the air. Humans are the apex species of this galaxy, not because they are strong. They are some of the weakest creatures in the stars, not because they are smart. Many species have greater intelligence. Humans are apex because they do something no other species can do. She looked down at with something that might have been a smile. "They make monsters want to be something better," and moved to stand with their brother, forming a protective circle around without even thinking about it. They had grown so much in the past year, but they still purred when she scratched behind their ear ridges. They still brought her gifts from their hunts. They still curled up beside her bed when she slept. They loved her, and she loved them. "The Dominion formally requests that humanity teach us what you know," announced. "We wish to learn this power you call compassion. We wish to understand why you love things that can hurt you, why you sacrifice for beings that can never repay you, why you believe that all life has value." The council erupted in noise. Representatives shouted questions. Some demanded explanations. Others simply stared in disbelief at the scene before them, but just smiled and stepped forward to address them all. "We would be happy to teach you," she said simply. "That is kind of what we do." Purred beside her, pressed close to her leg, kept watch over the room, ready to protect his human from any threat. And High Commander of the Dominion, feared conqueror of 12 systems, watched the small human woman who had changed everything, and felt something warm grow in her chest. It was love. She had finally learned what it meant. Above them, through the great windows of the council chamber, the stars continued to shine on a galaxy that would never be quite the same again, because humanity had proven what they had always known deep in their hearts. The greatest strength in the universe was not the power to destroy. It was the power to love. And that was something worth spreading to every corner of the stars.